3, 7, and 8 years old. 3 children brutally shot, leaving one dead, one paralyzed, and one clinging on to life after suffering a stroke. What monster could carry out such a heinous act? Their mother. This is the case of Elizabeth Diane Downs. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Jaylina and I'm currently in a school bus that I built out myself filming this video, and my family and I, or my partner and I should say, are currently building out a 29 flat-nose Bluebird school bus into a tiny home on wheels. And I want to take you guys along for the ride. We will be traveling the US, and I want to bring you guys cases from all the places that we are going to visit. We are currently stationed in Oregon, and so while we are still in Oregon, I'm bringing you all the cases from the area and around the state. We are currently around the Eugene area, and today's case comes from Springfield, Oregon, which is pretty much a suburb town just outside of Eugene. So this is the case of Diane Downs. Police actually believe that she may have been planning this brutal attack on her children for days, maybe even weeks before she actually went through with it. She showed up to the ER, the McKenzie-Willamette hospital in Springfield, Oregon, which is actually where my daughter Ember was born. I didn't even register that while we were there, but kind of creepy to think about now and looking back, but to look back and know that this is where her kids were treated and this was also where my daughter was born is just a little wild to me. On May 19th, 1983, Diane showed up with her 3 children in her car, all shot. On scene, Cheryl was pronounced dead, and Christy had suffered a stroke, and little Danny was paralyzed from the waist down. Danny was 3 years old. Cheryl was 7 years old, and Christy is 8 years old at the time. The stroke left Christy unable to speak, and Diane actually only had one wound, which was to her left forearm, and she had that wrapped in a towel. She did not tend to her children's wounds, just herself. Diane goes by her middle name, but her full name is Elizabeth Diane Downs. She was born in Phoenix, Arizona on August 7th, 1955 to Wes and Willadine Fredrickson. Her parents were very conservative. She did grow up in a strict household. Her mother was a Baptist and very firm in her beliefs, and she did a lot of her focus was a lot on tending to her husband. It is said that her father was very, very strict though, and if she did come home from school and she didn't have homework, her father would make her read the dictionary. Diane does claim that her father began sexually assaulting her at the age of 12, but it did not last very long because they were almost caught after being pulled over by a police officer. Diane claims that after that he did not partake in those inappropriate activities any longer. Growing up, Diane did a pretty good job of upholding her beliefs that she was raised in, being Baptist and just following along with her roots. She did, live a good life, like she was a good kid. But around the age of 14, she began to rebel, and she started participating in activities like smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. In high school, she really wanted to fit in, but she just didn't fit in. She did really like attention from boys, and it is said that she was boy crazy. She eventually started dating a guy named Stephen Downs, and they dated in high school, but after high school they parted ways. Stephen went off to the Navy and Diane went to college. She briefly attended Pacific Coast Baptist College in Orange, California. She did say that this was a time in her life where she felt popular for the first time. She felt like she fit in and she was having a great time in college, but she did eventually get expelled after about a year for promiscuous behavior, which she slept with a boy on the altar of the church. And yeah, I don't know why they couldn't find a room, but they decided that the altar of the church was the best place to get down. So she was caught in the middle of that, and she was expelled from school after only just a year. which forced her to move back home to her parents' house, which is the time that Stephen actually came back from the Navy for whatever reason. Stephen and Diane wound up reconnecting at this time, but Diane's parents did not approve of Stephen. They did not think that Stephen was good enough for their daughter. They did not want them dating, but I'm sure that Diane, being the rebellious kid that she is, only made her want to date Stephen more. So she continued to date Stephen. In November of 1973, Stephen went to Diane's house to pick her up for a date and then did not return her home. So when she didn't come home, her dad got pretty angry about this, and he tracked the two of them down and basically said, either marry my daughter or this is not going to continue. So they wound up getting married. Kind of shotgun wedding, but it was their choice to, if they wanted to continue dating, that they had to get married. So they did. And Diane became Diane Downs. So after they got married, Stephen actually did not want to start a family right away. He wanted to wait quite a while before having kids. But Diane had these dreams of becoming a mom, and so she decided she was going to have a kid, whether Stephen wanted to have children or not. So she stopped taking her birth control, unbeknownst to Stephen, and became pregnant with their first child and gave birth to Christy Ann in October 7th of 1974. I did find information that said that Diane claimed that Stephen was physically abusive. I don't know how true that is, but in a way for Diane to kind of take control of her life in that situation, she decided that she was going to join the Navy and left Christy with Steve and went and joined the Navy. But her time at the Navy only lasted about 3 weeks into training before she decided to return home to Stephen. I've read claims that it was because Stephen called and said that she had a baby at home that she needed to take care of. I've also read that it was because Stephen wasn't taking good enough care of the baby, and then also that she had like extremely bad blisters, and so she left because of medical reasons. So after returning home to Stephen, Diane soon became pregnant with their second child, and she wound up giving birth to Cheryl Lynn in January of 1976. It was after the birth of their second child, Stephen began to kind of be stressed out because he didn't know how he was going to afford to take care of their family. He definitely didn't want to have more kids because of financial reasons. So he decided he was going to get a vasectomy. He did go in for the procedure, and after the procedure, Diane wound up getting pregnant again. And Stephen did speculate that she was having an affair, but after going to the doctor, Stephen realized, or he found out, that he was still fertile, because back then, and I think still now, you are supposed to go for like your checkup after the procedure to make sure that the procedure worked, and that was something Stephen did not do. So he was still fertile. The procedure did not work. So Diane actually decided to abort. She terminated that pregnancy, and Stephen made it very clear that he didn't want to have any more kids. So it was after this, the couple decided that they were going to move their family to Mesa, Arizona, where Stephen and Diane both took jobs at a mobile home manufacturing company. And it was here that Diane met a very young 19-year-old coworker named Russ that she decided she was going to start an affair with. So she began sleeping with Russ and soon became pregnant again with her third child. She has basically said that to her, Russ was just a sperm donor. It's been said that she did not necessarily let Russ see his child unless she needed a babysitter. Russ loved his kid. He wanted to be a good dad, but Diane made that pretty difficult for him. Diane experienced some bleeding during this pregnancy, and in an attempt to have a safer environment for her pregnancy, she wound up quitting her job at the mobile home manufacturing company and got a job at the U.S. Postal Service because she thought it would be less strenuous of a job and it would be healthier for her pregnancy. And on December 26th of 1979, Diane gave birth to her third child, Stephen Danny Downs, who goes by Danny. Yes, she named her love child after her husband, who was not the father of her kid. I don't know where she was going with that thought process. So Stephen spent a lot of time at work, often leaving Diane feeling lonely. She would get upset and use the kids against Stephen. She would run away with them. She usually would come back, but it just wasn't a good home life for the children. She would often leave the kids home alone. I mean, her oldest child was only 8, and she would often, even at the age of 6, be left home alone to take care of the other 2 kids. A former neighbor of theirs did say that I think a week before the incident, Cheryl confided in them and said that she was afraid of her mom. And many have claimed that Diane was very selfish. She was an unfit mother and pretty much all the time put her needs and her wants above those of her children. She often cheated on Steve, and Steve knew that she was having several affairs, which pretty much, and he knew that Danny was not his child, which led to their divorce about a year after Danny was born in 1981. It was around this time that Diane realized she loved being pregnant, so she was going to become a surrogate, and she applied to become a surrogate, but she failed the psychological testing. Some of the testing actually came back showing signs of psychosis. So Diane did not get approved to become a surrogate at that company, so she decided she was going to start her own surrogacy firm or agency, whatever you call it. And she did have one successful full-term pregnancy. She gave birth to a baby girl for a couple who was having a hard time getting pregnant, and they paid her $10,000, and she was hoping to use this to help her become financially independent, which $10,000 back then is more than $10,000 today. After her surrogate pregnancy was over, Diane began a love affair with a coworker of hers named Robert Knickerbocker. Robert Knickerbocker was married, but she quickly fell in love with Robert. She gave him the nickname Nick because of his last name, Knickerbocker, so she refers to him as Nick. I'm going to refer to him as Robert. Robert was very hot and cold when it came to Diane. He would make her promises and then go back on his promises. He would tell her that, he would leave his wife for her, but he never did leave his wife. Obviously, he also had a rocky marriage. Sometime during this relationship, Diane decided she was going to take a job at a U.S. Postal Office here in Eugene to be closer to her parents. And Robert did at one point even tell Diane that he would be willing to move to Eugene with her, but that did not happen. And this was all in 1983 when she made her move to Oregon. There was even one incident or a mention of Diane offered to off Robert's wife for him in order for them to be together. Obviously, Robert was not really into that idea. Robert said that Diane basically became very aggressive in her affection towards him. She was very obviously obsessed and, in my opinion, infatuated. Infatuation is an intense, short-lived passion or admiration for someone or something, and I definitely think that her admiration toward Robert was very, very, very intense. She began to write Robert letters, and she would write about him in her diary. It was just very, very, very apparent that she was very obsessed with Robert. Robert eventually told Diane that he was not going to leave his wife and that he did not want to have kids and he did not want to be a father to her kids. And I think it was at this point where I want to say a light bulb went off in her head, but went on in her head, but I think a light bulb went off in her head. I think at this point she realized that her kids were an obstacle keeping her away from the love of her life. Robert Knickerbocker. And I think this is where, obviously, this is where her idea came to get rid of her children so that she could be with Robert. Diane did not like taking no for an answer. She was not a woman who did not get what she wants, and she knew how to get what she wanted. So what really happened that night? Diane claimed that Diane claimed that they went to visit a friend, and her friend did say, and she stated that she had no idea that Diane and the kids were coming. So they just showed up at her house, they visited, and then on the way home, Diane decided she was just going to take a nightly stroll down Old Mohawk Road in Springfield, Oregon. Creepy back road. Like, she says that this is a thing that they did all the time, that the kids loved it. They like to go down back roads to sightsee, but this was at around 9 to 10 o'clock at night that they were sightseeing, and she also claimed that the kids were asleep in the car. So why not just go straight home on a normal road? Just a little weird, kind of a weird thing to do, just in general. She says that while they were driving, there was in her words, bushy-haired man, a bushy-haired stranger that emerged in the middle of the road. He was flagging her down, and she claims that she pulls the car over. She gets out of the car, takes the keys out of the ignition, and she's like, yo, what do you want? And the bushy-haired stranger is like, I'm going to take your car. And I think her exact words were, you gotta be kidding me. So Diane claims that he was, going to steal her car. And so she says he then shoots all three of her children, and she's trying to fight him off. In that fight that they're having, he shoots her in the arm, and she says that she pretends to throw her keys in the bush to distract him, and then she jumps back in her car and puts the keys in the ignition, speeds off as fast as she can to the hospital. There are witnesses that say she was not speeding to the hospital. She was going very, very, very slow, like 5 miles an hour. The witness that they interviewed actually said that she was going so slow that his speedometer didn't even register that he was driving at all, because she was going so slow, and he wound up having to speed around her. And there were multiple witnesses saying that she was driving slow. So when she arrived at the hospital, the nurses did make note that, her arm was wrapped in a towel. Her children's wounds were not tended to. So Cheryl was pronounced dead on arrival. Little Danny was shot, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. Her oldest, Christy, suffered a stroke, leaving her unable to speak, and she was definitely in critical condition. Diane told the police that while she was driving them to the hospital, that she was praying, that she asking or telling God, like, if you're going to take my babies, like, if you're going to take my kids, just let them die. Don't suffer. If they got to die, just let them die. Just don't let them suffer.
And God, do it best. If they got to die, let them die, but don't let them suffer.
Weird thing to say as a parent. I think that most of us parents, you would think in that situation, if you're praying to God, you're going to pray to God that your kids don't die. Just my opinion. So at the hospital, Diane was very disconnected. She was very cold. She was not acting in a way that you would expect a parent to act in that situation. I mean, you can't necessarily judge someone on how they act in tragedy and in grief. You just never know how you're going to act. But I think that most parents would agree that that is not how they would act in this situation. Again, though, that is just a personal opinion. Nurses and police also noted that she didn't show any emotion, like that her daughter Cheryl had just died when they, told her. She just didn't seem to really care. And, her other kids were in critical condition, and she just wasn't super worried about it. So, according to officers who interviewed Diane, she just seemed more concerned with her new car and the fact that there was blood all over the place. She said she just ruined her new car. Also, again, just like something very weird to be concerned about when one of your kids just died and your other two, they don't even, you don't even know if they're going to make it. So, police were immediately suspicious of Diane's story. And while at the hospital, Diane's first phone call was not to Steve, the father of her two girls, who one had just been pronounced dead and the other one is in critical condition. She did not call Russ, Danny's father. She immediately called Robert Knickerbocker. I'm assuming to let him know that her children were no longer an obstacle in their way and of their love story. Now, Diane's story changes several times. First, it was a bushy-haired man. Then she said that it was two men in ski masks, and then she claimed to actually know the guy who did it, and she even says to the police, I damn sure do know who did it. And
changed it by saying that this guy knew you now, he knew your tattoo, he knows about you, he threatened you. That's a hell of a change from what you said the first time around.
First sign of guilt and deceit is their stories changing. So one thing I do want to point out that I think is really interesting, here is the compository sketch of the bushy-haired man that Diane gave the police. Something that I noticed here, something that is very interesting, is that something that people often do when they are lying and they have to do a compository sketch and they work with a sketch artist is they actually don't have a real description because there is no face. So subconsciously, they actually start describing themselves and their own facial features. So I'm just going to put this sketch up here and a couple photos of Diane. I personally think they do look a little bit similar, especially in the eyes. Just my opinion. I have not heard anyone else talk about this or state this. This is something that just immediately popped in my head as soon as I saw that compository sketch. Like, to me, it looked a little bit like her. And after I learned that that was something that people do when they're lying and they don't have an actual face, and they start to subconsciously like describe their own facial features, that stood out to me. So I just wanted to kind of see what you guys think on that particular small subject of this video in general. So what is beautiful and fascinating about forensic and blood spatter is it does not lie. Diane, on the other hand, does lie. So there was blood spatter on the outside of the passenger side. When the police asked about this, Diane said, it must have been blood drops from when they took her out of the car into the hospital. But forensic shows that it was not blood drops, but blood spatter. So there were some drops of blood because of that. But the majority of that blood that the police were referring to was blood spatter, meaning that Christy had to be outside of the car when she was shot, which Diane said that none of her kids were outside of the car, that they were all inside of the car when they were shot. So that discredits some of her story right there. And also, just in my opinion, why would someone brutally attack 3 children in an attempt to steal a car, and the one person who actually would have a chance of fighting them off, they like only shoot her in the arm? Just another weird thing about this case, that obviously stands out. So anyways, police asked Diane if she owned a gun. She claimed that she did not own any guns. And after interviewing both Stephen and Robert, they found out that Diane, in fact, does own a gun. She owns multiple guns. And she also bought a handgun in Arizona. Although they did not find the gun itself, they did find unfired casings at her home with extractor markings from the same gun that shot all 3 children. Diane's not looking good at this point. Her story's all over the place. The evidence is just piling up against her. It's just not a great look for her. So Diane was taking every chance that she could get to be on TV, make appearances, do all kinds of interviews. And in doing this, she was kind of digging her own grave. She definitely put her foot in her mouth. Like, she should not have been doing all these interviews. To me, it just seemed like she really liked the attention. It seems like that's the kind of person that she is. She's just really down for attention, and she was finally getting a lot of it.
He's gonna walk again. I shot my daughter. Swung around. He was, take the keys.
One huge major thing that was going on was every time Diane would visit Christy in the hospital, Christy's vitals would be totally normal, and as soon as Diane walked in, her heart rate would just skyrocket, and she was just obviously visibly uncomfortable, and she was still unable to talk. So she seemed afraid. This was something that the nurses definitely noted and was off to them. So while Christy was in the hospital, she was working with a therapist, and this therapist came up with this genius idea. So Christy knew who shot her, and she was too afraid to tell anyone. So her therapist came up with the idea of having Christy write down who shot her, and then they would throw the paper in the fireplace and they would burn it. And the therapist's thought behind this was that hopefully Christy would get comfortable enough to one day not burn it and be able to share it with her. And it worked. Over time, Christy built up the courage to finally show her what she was writing on those pieces of paper. And I definitely don't know how this therapist was feeling, if she felt like she knew what was going to be on that paper or not. But when she looked at that piece of paper, it said, "My mom." And I know that that had to be so heartbreaking to be the person that like reads that piece of paper, to be the person that Christy was able to open up to at that time, and how Christy feels to have to tell people like, my mom is the one that tried to kill me. She shot me. She shot my brother, and she killed my little sister. It's just truly heart-wrenching, and it's something that I will never understand. So Christy would go on to testify against her mother, and it was largely due to her testimony against her mom that Diane was convicted. So Diane drove down that dirt road that night, stopped her car on the side of the road. She got out of her car, went to her trunk, grabbed her 22 caliber gun, proceeded to shoot all three of her children, and then shoot herself in the arm to make her story more believable. She then drove extremely slow to the hospital in hopes that none of her children would make it, and she came up with this version of events with the bushy-haired man. It said that she shot her two kids in the back first, and in an attempt to escape, Christy opened the door. She was on the ground, and Diane shot her while she was on the ground, put her back in the car, and then drove to the hospital. Diane Downs was arrested on February 28, 1984, 9 months after the tragic shooting. She was charged with murder and 2 counts each of attempted murder and criminal assault. While on trial, Diane became pregnant again. I've read that she slept with a reporter, and I've also read that she slept with a coworker from the post office. To this day, no one knows who is the father of that child. Diane gave birth to her 4th child a month before her trial, a baby girl. The baby was seized by the state of Oregon and put up for adoption. When asked in an interview why she got pregnant again, her response was very eerie. This is her response.
I was extremely lonely. I missed my kids desperately. I had just seen Christy on the 2nd of October. It's like opening a wound and pouring salt in. I was extremely lonely. October 13th, I just went and got pregnant.
What's eerie to me about this statement is when she says that she just saw her daughter Christy, she was referring to seeing her daughter in court, literally testifying against her, talking about how her mom shot her. And that's why she decided to get pregnant again. Just blows my mind. Like, wow. What a thought process. Diane was found guilty on all charges on June 17th, 1984. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Psychiatrists diagnosed Downs with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. Diane has always maintained her innocence. One thing about her claims that really stuck out to me, every time she tries to justify her story, she says things like, if she were to do such a horrific act, wouldn't she do a better job of it?
If I had shot my own children, would I not have done a good job of it? Why would I have taken my kids to the hospital? Wouldn't I have made sure they were dead and then cried crocodile tears?
Excuse me, what? Like, all I'm saying is, in my mind, as a mother, if I were in that situation, which my thought wouldn't, and my response would not be, if I was going to kill my kids, I would do a better job of it. My thought is, I could never. Hello? I could never do that. I didn't do this. I could never do that. That's what, in my opinion, that's what a normal, innocent parent would think. Like, they wouldn't think, oh, I would do a better job of it. I'd get the job done. No. If any sane person's thought process is like, I couldn't do these things. How could you accuse me of this? I could never do that. Again, just my opinion. After her trial, one of the prosecutors on this case, Fred Hugh, and his wife Joanne adopted Christy and Danny. On July 11th, 1987, Diane actually managed to escape prison by hopping over a barbed wire fence using her jacket to get over the top. And she hid under her car until the coast was clear. And then she made her way about half a mile from the prison to a former cellmate's husband's house and was just chilling with the hubos. So I think when they actually did find her, she came out in like his boxer briefs. So interesting fact about that situation. So that was in Salem, Oregon, and a huge manhunt was on, and she was found, like I said, about half a mile from the prison, and she was arrested and transferred to a maximum security prison after that. And as far as, to my knowledge, is it's still incarcerated. I'm not sure where. I know she was transferred to California. I've also heard that she was transferred to New Jersey. I'm not sure which is true or which is where she's at the moment. Diane's youngest child, now Rebecca Babcock, was adopted. And at the age of 11, she tricked a babysitter into telling her who her real mom was by pretending to already know. And so she just waited for her babysitter to say her name. And then when she did, she went and looked her up and was pretty stricken by this. I definitely messed with her mentally, and I don't know if it was because of this, but after this, going into puberty, she definitely got into a little bit of trouble. She was not going down a very good course in her life, but eventually in adulthood, she did get her life together. She began writing Diane in prison, but quickly realized that Diane was indeed crazy. Those are her words. She said that Diane started to say wild things like she was in prison because she was dating a big politician and she was in there for protection. And then she began telling Rebecca about all these different conspiracy theories that were people conspiring against her. And when Rebecca just wasn't buying it, Diane then started accusing Rebecca of being out to get her. And so Rebecca at one point had to even ask Diane to stop writing her. Rebecca has expressed her belief that Diane is no doubt guilty. And she is actually now on a quest to find her birth father. And if you would like to know more and follow along on her journey, check out the podcast Happy Face Presents Two Face. That is a podcast that I actually listened to her first podcast about her dad, who's a serial killer, and now she is helping Rebecca figure out who her biological father is. So that is the case of Diane Downs, the most infamous true crime case in the state of Oregon to date. I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and hitting that little like button if you would like to see more videos. Feel free to comment down below. Let me know what you think about this case. I want to hear all of your thoughts. And also, if you have any case suggestions, especially in Oregon, since that's where I'm at currently, drop them down below. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys on the next case.